Hey, and welcome back to my channel, HMO History. I want to make sure that as an experienced history teacher, I'm giving you the best advice that you could possibly have going into your GCSE exams. Whether you're sitting them this year or next year, it's brilliant to get into shape now with how to revise, how best to look at the content for the courses, as well as learning from me some key examiner tips on how to best write essays. Now, my students think it's strange enough that I love historical writing and I love crafting essays, and I want to impart to you that knowledge on how best to avoid some key mistakes in the exam. Today we're going to be looking at making links to the question and why it is so important to make sure you're getting into those higher levels on the mark scheme and pushing you into the boundaries of grades 7 to 9. So stick around if you want to find out some key structural approaches to how to ace your essay writing in history. Now in this video in particular, we're going to be looking at the edXL GCSE history syllabus, and I'm going to be focusing on two exams in particular: the depth study of Elizabethan England, as well as some questions from the crime and punishment paper. Don't worry if you don't study these papers, because the techniques are the same across the exam board for all papers. Now let's start with looking at the problem. What are the common mistakes that students are making with these exams? From looking at various examiner reports, as well as understanding my own students, some of the key things that come up as mistakes we're making are things like telling the story. This is falling into the trap of trying to tell the examiner everything you know about a historical period, and it becomes far too narrative. Now, quite often I say to my students that they're going around the houses, and this is essentially falling into the trap of telling the examiner everything you think you know about the topic, but moving yourself away from the focus of the question. The second, we also have misreading the question. Now, within the question itself, there are often a lot of keywords to try and decode to understand what the question is actually asking us. This can be the focus of the question itself, it could be the criteria that it's asking us to make a judgment towards, and it could be the date range itself that it's asking us to stay within the parameters of. The third is not being explicit enough in our links. Now, this is a really easy fix, and it's about the language that we use to make sure that we are showing to the examiner we know we are focusing all of our historical knowledge on answering a particular question. Throughout this video, we're going to look at some key techniques to combat each of these issues. Let's look at this first question. Explain why the Puritans challenged Elizabeth's religious settlement. Here is an example of a candidate answer on the left. The Puritans were a group of extremely strict Protestants who believed in a more simplistic and stripped-back version of Christianity. They believed that Catholic practices were too extravagant and that idols were a distraction from practicing their faith. They did not agree at having crucifixes placed inside churches because they practiced their faith mainly through reading passages of the Bible and silent prayer, rather than attending services. Now let's pick this candidate response apart a little bit. This comment at the bottom is taken directly from the examiner report for this exam in 2020, and it shows that level 2 answers were generally providing a narrative of Puritan issues with the religious settlement, rather than digging deeper into why they were challenging Elizabeth, because of how it clashed with their beliefs. Now, this answer feels really detailed, and there is some key concrete knowledge about Puritans and their beliefs here. What's happened is this has turned into a story about who the Puritans are and what they believe. We're seeing some details about how it was a more simplistic and stripped-back version of Christianity. We're seeing some details on how they disagree with crucifixes, and we're getting an insight into how they practice their faith through reading passages of the Bible. But what this response hasn't done is linked each of these to a problem with the religious settlement itself. Although it says that crucifixes were placed inside churches, it doesn't particularly pay any attention to the fact that Elizabeth chose this as a compromise to keep Catholics on her side. It also doesn't show why it clashes with their beliefs of idolatry, and that they see it as a remnant of Roman Catholic faith in England. Although it does show us detail on the way Puritans practice their beliefs, it's not really linking back to the question of why this is of particular challenge to Elizabeth and her religious settlement. Let's have a look at this answer rewritten in a slightly more focused way. The Puritans disagreed with the religious settlement due to their strict Protestant beliefs and anger at Elizabeth for including practices in English churches that remained heavily linked to Roman Catholicism. They especially disliked crucifixes, which Elizabeth retained as part of her compromise to help keep a similar look and feel for English Catholics. Puritans claimed this was idolatry, and many bishops threatened to resign if Elizabeth allowed them. Here we have a comment from the mark scheme about candidates achieving a level 4 response. And it says that candidates were able to provide detailed analysis of how Puritan beliefs were clashing with the religious settlement itself. For example, we are using language here to show that they were angered by Elizabeth's choice of retaining crucifixes. It makes note of the fact that Elizabeth was trying to compromise herself at the expense of Puritan beliefs. And it goes into some of the problems that Elizabeth faced from the Puritans because of this. For example, many of the bishops choosing to resign. Hopefully you can see here the difference that the language makes. Making sure that we're always thinking about how did this challenge, why does this link to the question, is key for turning our writing from descriptive into analytical. Because you're so eager to get out all of your historical knowledge about these topics, it is very easy to fall into the trap of becoming too narrative. So here are my top tips to try and keep you on track and linking back to the question. The first is to think, so what? Is this piece of evidence relevant to the overall question? After you've written a sentence, you should pause and ask yourself, is this important for the overall question? If you can't immediately explain the relevance of why you've chosen to put that in, you're probably being too narrative. Try to limit context to just one sentence. If you're explaining what something is, or you're giving some background information as to why something happened, try to minimize it to one sentence only. Use language that automatically leads you into explanation, using phrases like, this meant that, because of this, this shows, therefore, or as a result of. This forces you to move beyond general surface level description. And one key tip is using words that are in the question. If the question talks about importance or significance, change, difference, development, use these words throughout your essay to make sure that you're always linking back to the key conceptual focus. Examiners love this, and you'll see that all over the examiner report, these constant references to linking back to the question. The next mistake we can easily make is misreading the question, and we are all guilty of it. Sometimes our mind is working in overdrive, we've got the stress of exams, and sometimes we just miss keywords, but this can be really important in making sure that you are answering the question correctly. Let's look at this example from the crime and punishment paper. This question is asking us to explain why there were new definitions of crimes against authority. There are a lot of things going on here. We have a date range, circa 1000 to 1700. We have a command word that we need to explain. We have a focus on definitions of crime, but that focus is also linked to the key term authority. So we don't want to jump straight in and start talking about all the crimes we know that happened between that date range. We want to make sure that we are honing in our knowledge to those crimes that impacted authority. Read the question a few times before you attempt to start planning it. With this question, remember it's about new definitions of crime. There might not be new crimes in their entirety. It might be that they already existed, but definitions changed. For example, poaching changed under William I because he introduced forest laws. Now, this was already a crime, but it criminalized different types of people who lived in those now royal forests. Heresy existed as a crime within the church. However, with the religious turmoil of the Tudor period, Henry VIII's break from Rome, and Elizabeth's religious settlement, you have more instances of heresy because people are going against the religion of the monarch. Remember, this exam paper is yours, so if you need to write on it, highlight it, or annotate the question, feel free to do so to make sure that you're really picking out the key focus of the question. My third common mistake was not explicitly marking our links to the questions. Now, as historians, we can assume that the examiners are historians too, and that they are marking our papers with a knowledge about what we are trying to talk about. But the connections that we're making in our minds might not always be the easiest connections for the examiners to make. We can write really good analysis and really good context, but if we forget to explicitly link it to the conceptual focus of the question, we can lose ourselves valuable marks. This sometimes comes down to our structure. With every paragraph we write, we should always aim to finish with a judgment sentence. That last bit is all about your key link back to the question. And this is where we start to see that language come into effect. Sometimes we can get to these sentences and we think that summarizing what we've already said is us coming to a sort of conclusion, but it's not always the case. We need to make sure that we're ending every paragraph with a sentence that directly addresses what the question was asking us. The easiest way to do this is to use language from the question. A slightly more difficult way is to make sure that we're weaving this analysis throughout our essay as a whole. And if you're pushing for grade 9, I would suggest attempting to practice this when you can. This is using the language of this suggests, this shows, this could reveal throughout your essay rather than just leaving it to the end of a paragraph. We can also flip this on its head and signpost where our explicit links are at the start of our paragraphs. One way in which this is important was because evidence that supports the view that the suggestion that crimes against authority changed is because, also with assuming that the examiner knows our knowledge, is avoiding drifting into vague pronouns. Saying things like they, he, she, it often makes the examiner lose track of what we're trying to particularly apply our attention to. Saying it caused issues is very different to saying the Treaty of Versailles caused issues. Or saying that this led to is very different to saying propaganda led to. Make sure we're being specific in what we're referring to throughout our essay rather than implying the knowledge and hoping the examiner understands. So then what is the solution? What are our practical tips to take away to help us stay on track for linking back to the question? Let's think about this in terms of before you write and whilst you write. So before you write, you want to make sure you've completely understood the question. Circle the command word, think about the criteria for how you're going to explain the answer, and plan out your paragraphs and their purpose in relation to the question. If it's an explain why, you're going to want 3 paragraphs with 3 separate points. Remember to go past the stimulus points that it gives you in the exam by adding in your own knowledge. And if it's a how far do you agree or an interpretation question, you want to be aiming for 5 paragraphs. That's including an introduction and a conclusion. Whilst you're writing, try to echo the words of the question throughout your paragraphs. Signpost what your explicit link is at the start. Keep your contextual knowledge limited to at least 1 sentence, and always explicitly make those links by using language such as a result, therefore, this led to. Make sure each of your paragraph ends with a mini conclusion and judgment sentence and link back to the question effectively. As a quick check at the end, when you're looking over your paper, you can make sure you're picking out some key words from the question. Have you included them within your essay? And make sure you're always thinking about the why. Why did these events happen? Not just explaining what they were. The golden rule here is that every single sentence should count, and everything should be leading the examiner to understand why you are answering that particular question. Hopefully this helps with your essay writing moving forward, and the best way to practice these skills are to have a go at completing some past papers. Lots of these can be found on Save My Exams or the Pearson Edexcel website. Make sure to subscribe and follow my channel if you want content revision, as well as my top teacher tips for acing your GCSE exams.